Welcome, Jeanette. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. I'm really honored to be here.
So, if you're ready, I'd love to jump into our first topic. And what I'm super curious about is your focus on the folks that are currently in the industry, the ones that have been here for a while, and ensuring that you can contribute to retaining them. Why is this important to you?
Yeah, great question. And first, I want to say that there are a lot of incredible organizations out there that are doing work for school-age children or young adults who are in college. And I try to support those as much as possible. I speak at schools as often as I can, and I'm invited to do. Um, but I don't know how we can have, if we don't have diverse leaders who are reflective of the general population, I don't know how we're going to inspire the next generation with role models. And I found throughout my career that being a minority in the aerospace industry, that there's kind of this underlying message sometimes of you don't belong, or we call it sometimes death by 1,000 cuts. And I'm trying to address that problem in a couple of different ways.
So, in terms of what you've done or are currently doing, I would love to know about the efforts that you started, maybe how it's since evolved, and maybe even how you see it going in the future.
Yeah, great. So I'm really excited to talk about the organization that I started in 2016. It's very grassroots kind of organization called the Bay Area Women in Space and Aerospace. As I was going through my career, I started meeting different women, meeting a group of women who worked at NASA Ames or used to work at NASA Ames together and then went somewhere else, or used to work at Maxar together. And I would get coffee with some of them, drinks with some of them, just be introduced to others. And I thought there really needs to be a way for us all to have a community and get together. So in fall of 2016, so 6 years ago now, I reserved the common room of my building. I was living in downtown at the time, and just sent an email to 10 women and said, bring a dish to share, bring a bottle of wine, we'll just like hang out. And it was wonderful. They forwarded it on to other people who ended up coming. And someone said at that event, I want to host the next one at Stanford. And then someone said, I want to host the next one at NASA Ames. It was kind of like onto something. And then people thought, we should really have programming. It shouldn't just be like a networking event. There should be programming. So one of my friends was an expert on negotiation. So the very first one that we did with programming was at Planet, where a friend of mine, Catherine Monson, and at the time the head of HR at Planet, talked about negotiation and giving tips and tricks. Since then it's become a speaker series. Pre-pandemic I was getting into a quarterly cadence and trying to get into that again with in-person events. And I don't necessarily want them to be talking about being a woman in aerospace, but rather featuring women doing incredible things. So we've had negotiation and self-branding. We had leaders talking about how they've navigated becoming leaders in this very male-dominated field. We've had female startup founders. We've had an astronaut from Korea, which was really cool. We've had some of the Brooke Owens Fellowship, current fellows and alumni speak. And I want it to be, to create that community by featuring these women. And then, at a micro view for the people that are attending, maybe you get a tip on leadership or negotiation that helps you out. Maybe you get an introduction to somebody that ends up helping your career. Or even, if you're dealing with toxic masculinity all day, just to see a room full of people who look like you, can be so powerful, and maybe, helps to overcome that death by 1,000 cuts, or that message of you don't belong that you've been hearing for days and years on end.
Wow, that's incredible. And as you were speaking, I was thinking about how even having you on this podcast or from the folks I've spoken to previously, I realize now how I was attempting to heal some of those cuts for folks in the space, and
Mhm.
also focus on the up leveling, the things that come out of those conversations on negotiation, and the things that people sometimes don't even have an opportunity to talk about or to
Yeah.
think about, because the focus is simply on being there or surviving in this
Yes,
space.
yes,
So
yeah.
thank you so much for the work you're doing. And
Thank
what
you.
I'd love to know about is what you think people can do to find where along the spectrum they should contribute to, as you mentioned, between the STEM outreach to the retention, or
Mm,
even further with sponsorships, instead of really throwing their hands up to say that nothing can be done and that the talent isn't there. Because this is something that I've come across in startup spaces that are looking for very senior or mid to senior applicants. And they throw their hands up and say, the talent isn't there. And actually, we just need to be focusing on the STEM education. So our top leadership might look homogenous because several years ago or a decade ago, things were just different.
mhm.
And why that's unfortunate is because that's not solving either end of the spectrum. It's not
Yeah.
helping retention, it's not promoting upwards or within the company. And oftentimes, those STEM programming for younger children, those things don't happen either at the companies. So it's this vicious cycle, really. And
Yeah.
so I would love to know about your thoughts on, one, how people can identify where they are on the spectrum of where they want to contribute, and just your thoughts on that whole throwing our hands up thing.
Yeah, yeah. And one of your questions earlier was, where do you see this group going? Where do I see my work going? And um, really, my passion is about hiring and retaining. So, exactly what you said there, a couple of years ago, kind of after the Me Too movement, it became trendy to have, female leaders, like, oh, we need to have a female leader, we need to have a female on our board. And then everybody realized there's no women who have who have been trained at that level. And part of that is, and you can't solve that by just going to elementary school kids and teaching them how to code. This is what I want to address is, the talent is entering the workforce, but it's leaving. And part of that frustration is not being promoted, at the first level, and just seeing all these men being promoted, before you. And part of that is, women don't ask, so I want to, help women to have the confidence and the tools of how to ask. Um, I want, you know, people to realize the criteria, because a lot of times they say, men have this potential to move up to the next level, but there's this unconscious bias that women need to prove themselves. And so for a long time, they're proving themselves with a lower pay by doing the job before they eventually get promoted. And then if women get frustrated that they're not getting promoted, they leave the industry, they leave the workforce, they, go somewhere else, career pivot. Um, so that's kind of what I want to address. And as far as, people who throw their hands up in the air, sometimes, the first things that I want to look at are, okay, let's look at your job descriptions. Do you use masculine words like wizard? We're looking for a wizard, or we're looking for a karate master in this, very masculine, like unwelcoming things. Are you asking for unnecessary degrees where, a man might apply anyway, but a woman might not if they don't meet all of that criteria? Um, who do you have representing your company at conferences or in public? Um, is that a woman? Is that a person of color? Is that, a guy who is really toxic, but like whatever, we're just gonna still stick him on stage? Like that is, that like sends red flag, and then people wonder why they can't, why they can't find the talent. Um, Even something as simple as your website branding, so that's kind of where I want to take this. And right before the pandemic, in March 11th of 2020, I held an event at the Satellite 2020 conference. with HR professionals from large companies and small companies, where we talked about, you know, all of these kind of things. And so that's kind of my long-term vision for the group. I don't know if I answered the question or kind of went off on a little tangent.
Absolutely. And with the HR spotlight, I definitely think HR as a business function has really come to the forefront during and after COVID. And as these new terms emerge in the working world, like quiet quitting or quiet firing, and there's so much that both employers and employees have to learn,
Yeah.
and it's constantly evolving. And so you focusing on that is so meaningful, especially at an event like Satellite. And I'm so excited to see future events because there's so many large conferences that focus on the technical or the outreach, but not that retention piece. It's
Yeah.
sort of like, oh, when you're like present in the thing that you've worked so hard to be in, it can not feel so great for some folks. I know these vibrant gender minorities or just minorities in these spaces that are so great at what they do, but the way that they feel or their felt relationship and emotional experiences in that dream role can feel so staggeringly different from what they thought they were signing up for because of these systemic issues and inequalities. So once again, thank you so much for everything that you're doing.
So it takes a village to do it. You know, I couldn't do it without the hosts. I couldn't do it without the sponsors. You know, I'm kind of a one-woman show, you know, putting this on, but it's sustained itself because of the people who continue to support it. And I will always be very, very internally grateful to all of them.
Absolutely. So I'd love to talk about our second topic and go a little bit backwards in your personal journey. And you had shared that you had lost family members when you were young, and you've since learned so much about the communities that come together to support one another who have these similar stories. Can you tell me more about these communities and maybe even what you've learned through engaging with them?
Yes, yeah, and be happy to. And you know, I don't usually get a chance to talk about this, so thank you also for the opportunity. So yeah, going back quite a ways, when I was 21 and a senior in college, finishing up my mechanical engineering degree, my mother passed away at the beginning of my second semester. She was 51 and I was 21. It was an 18-month battle with leukemia that unfortunately she lost. Right around the same time, my father was diagnosed with head and neck cancer. He was never a smoker, you know, it was just kind of a fluke thing. He lived a little bit longer than she did, but he really suffered from the complications of the treatments that he had. And eventually he succumbed to the complications when I was 27, he was 58, right when I was relocating from Rochester, New York, to California. I didn't find a community or a fit for a really long time. I think I spent a lot of time quiet and angry and in, you know, a very dark place. And one day I was like LinkedIn stalking random people and like going through, you know, just like that rabbit hole. And I stopped dead in my tracks when I saw in someone's volunteer experience that they had been a host for this organization called the Dinner Party, which is for people in their 20s and 30s and early 40s who have had a significant loss. And at the time, it was kind of local tables that people would host with people who had a loss. So I volunteered to become a host in San Francisco. You know, they were always looking for hosts and people who could host, and I was fortunate enough to be able to do that. I still have it, even though I'm not a host anymore. I'm more of a member. I still have it in my volunteer experience on LinkedIn, just in case someone else finds that really helpful as they're LinkedIn stalking me. in February 2020, right before the pandemic shut down, I went to Esalen, which is a retreat here in Northern California, right along the coast, where I met people who suffered all sorts of losses. But I met quite a few people who had had a dual parent loss. So there was kind of this instant community around that. And before that, I met one person through, the local hosting, and another person just kind of randomly by chance who had lost parents early. But this was the first time that I was really surrounded by multiple people who had that experience. So then, of course, the pandemic happened. No one was having dinner parties anymore. And I think this was actually a crucial part for the organization. They created these affinity groups where you weren't restricted by geography around, certain types of losses that might be particularly hard or particularly isolating, or even, identities of the person who's had the loss where you're not restricted by geography. So I'm a part of a group that's with dual parent, and it's just been so pivotal to be connected with all of these people over the last year as a part of my journey. And what I've learned is, a couple of points. Loss can feel so isolating. I thought I was the only person who lost their parent in college, at the time. And it's really just the community is out there. It's just about, finding it. You're not as alone. It does get better, but it's still an ongoing journey. And sometimes I'll do like an event for Mother's Day, a virtual event with Mother's Day or Father's Day. And people who have just had a loss are really discouraged that I'm still there, still doing the work. They're like, why are you still here 10 years later? Because I'd rather be around those people than like out and about seeing people getting brunch with their moms on Mother's Day.
Absolutely. And it never really like changes that circumstance. So there's never really a I'm fine. Perhaps there's only a I'm doing better.
Yeah.
And I say this with perspective of my parent who lost a parent when they were really young. They were actually the same age as you. And so again, this topic is really meaningful. And so I've heard I'm doing better, but I'll never really be fine throughout my whole life.
Yeah. And the people who are around you, and that's so important too. You probably never met that grandparent, but you're still affected by your parents' loss of that grandparent. So it kind of ripples out too to not just you. And it's easier for me to talk about my parents' loss because they died of cancer, no fault of their own. It's a lot harder for people to talk about it when there might be drug addiction, or suicide, or, mental illness, or an estranged relationship. Jeanette McCurdy is in the news right now with her book, I'm Glad My Mom Died. Like there's, I didn't have the best relationship with both of my parents, but it certainly was healthy, and fine. And so it's almost easier for me to talk about that. And there needs to be a special grace with people who lost people through, harder circumstances than that.
Absolutely. And so beyond community, what tools or resources have you found that were helpful to you as you sort of evolved on this journey of navigating loss?
Yeah, there's so many resources out there now. Anderson Cooper has a new podcast out that's called All There Is, where he discusses grief, and he's got some in-depth interviews with people. And like anything, there is an Instagram account for anything. I actually follow several grief accounts. Some of them are dark humor. Some of them are very, journal heavy. Some, they're kind of a little bit of everything out there for everybody. So it's whatever kind of works for you, and what might work for somebody doesn't work for somebody else, or even the same, from day to day, week to week. year to year, or maybe, you kind of need a hybrid of community and just, journaling for hours. Kind of everybody copes with it differently, even, day to day, year to year.
Wow, yeah. And you touched on this with the volunteer experience and leaving that on your page for people to find it later. What else do you hope that folks know, or what do you hope to pass on to them when it comes to navigating loss and how it really shapes who we are and how we show up in our wellness and leadership practices?
Yeah. A couple of things on that. One is, bereavement policies are, a very important thing for companies to consider. A lot of companies have just a couple of days, and to think if your spouse dies, if your parent dies, if your child dies, somebody close to you, 3 days is not enough. In college, I ended up taking off. I was also the executrix of my mother's estate because my parents divorced when I was young. But I ended up taking a couple weeks off and having to come back and working with a TA to make up, the work. And, professors gave me grace. And, you don't have to make up the homework as long as you can take the test with everybody. You're fine. But everybody also deals with it in different ways. Some people need 2 weeks of like going off the, going totally off the grid. You don't hear from them. And then I've worked with people who want to have the meeting like the day after their parent dies, because their way of coping is to distract themselves with something, and I'm having this conversation like, you can't possibly be caring about what we're talking about right now. But I also recognize that was what that person needed in the moment. And, I'm there for them. If they want to talk about it, that's, talk about our, whatever stupid topic we had that must have been so irrelevant, compared with their father dying, that's fine. I'm there for them. If they need to go off of the grid for 2 weeks, you let me know too. And sometimes it's also communicating that to people if you can, and if you have the words. Sometimes people just don't have the words or the wherewithal, especially in the moment, to be able to say that. But if you can, just help the people around you know what you need as well.
That's really, really helpful. And I think that this is really a checkpoint for people who, clicked on this episode because they were curious about this particular topic, to really take note, because bereavement policies aren't something that you're maybe told of as a 21 to 22-year-old signing a job contract. I wouldn't have known to look, or wouldn't have known to ask or to advocate for something like that. And so definitely with these policies being so different across different organizations, I just hope that folks listening take a moment to really let that sink in, because anything can happen really at any time. And so it's important to know about that and to look at it head on, I think, instead of avoiding it for later when it does become an issue, but it's so much harder than to juggle everything. With our first two topics on the retention and then the topic of loss, I was curious if there was anything that you felt like you wanted to add to any of those things, any other thoughts that have come up before we move on to our last topic?
Yeah, there's kind of an interlying, or interweaving theme, which is, in thinking about, maybe for the leaders out there who have the chance to inform policy at their company, thinking outside of yourself. I see so many times, and I think Sheryl Sandberg is somebody that we're all supposed to idolize, but something that I think that's been really flawed is her husband died while she was at Facebook, and now Facebook has this incredible bereavement policy. But you have to think of, there were thousands of people who must have lost somebody before Sheryl Sandberg did. Similarly, there's expectant mother parking at Google because when she was there, she had a really difficult pregnancy. There were probably a lot of women who had difficult pregnancies there before too. And I saw the same thing with Alexis, Serena Williams's husband. I've never actually had to say his name out loud, but we all know the Reddit Alexis. After his daughter was born, he said, "Oh, we need to have 16 weeks policy. That should be across the board." I kind of step back and think, well, I'm sure you had a lot of employees who had kids who would have loved to have had a 16-week policy before you suddenly had a child. So I think just empathy for other people, and for those people who are in leadership positions and can influence policy. Parental leave is not just a women's topic. It's a parental topic, but it certainly helps with retention and hiring. So think about these things before they affect you, because hopefully bereavement doesn't ever have to affect you, but it may affect some of your employees, or parental leave might not affect you, but it does affect your other employees.
Absolutely. And I was listening in on this really interesting discussion about just the word empathy and the urgency that evokes. And this was after a lot of the riots that we've seen in these past couple of years pertaining to so many issues for so many types of minorities. And folks in the majorities in those spaces had asked, well, what can we do? And this was well-meaning, but someone had said, act like it's your house that's on fire. And so the thing with empathy there is, it sounds like this really nice, fluffy word to me that I don't think a lot of the times lands, where it may be in your mind, but maybe it's not at the forefront of your mind. And so when an employee says in their weekly check-in or tag up that something has happened, I don't know if all the times it really pushes someone to think oh, let me now translate this to a top level policy, because it maybe doesn't feel like it's your house that's on fire.
Yes.
And so I think I'd love this topic, and I'm curious to see where that goes really. I think even beyond empathy, there's so many other things that we can all do better and leaders can do better at, but I'm excited to see how this is explored in the near future.
That's a great topic, because for a lot of those leaders, they're never going to experience what it's like to be a person of color. That you can go through a birth, you can go through a bereavement, but you can't change your race and your experiences that way. So that's an example of where you really do need to be, as a leader, listening to your employees and listening to what they need, and listening to and implementing policies that help folks, promoting them, featuring them as speakers, featuring them on their website, helping in ways that you can, because if we all wait until we go through an experience to change a policy, there's limitations to that.
Absolutely. So I'd love to talk about our last topic, which is career pivots. And I'm curious about what you've learned in transitioning from being a thermal engineer to business development to now program management.
Mm-hmm.
And when did you know it was time to make a switch? So maybe just breaking down the first one between being a thermal engineer to business development. When did you know it was the right time?
So I was a thermal engineer for 11 years, and I loved it. I think thermal engineering is incredible because you have to know about every little part of the satellite and how it interacts and how it operates, when it operates. You do testing on the ground. You have to make sure the satellite works from the first day that it's on orbit, survives launch, first day on orbit, to maybe the 20th year that it's on orbit, no matter how it needs to be used. But I I didn't see myself as like a senior thermal fellow. I knew that I wanted to be a little bit more outward facing. My last job as a thermal engineer was with OneWeb, and I was one of the early employees at OneWeb. And we had this incredible opportunity to really build a satellite from scratch. A lot of us had come from traditional aerospace where you're limited by what's been done over the last, couple of decades. And so we had this trade space and that was very open. And we did a survey of like the whole industry. I was thermal and I was on the power subsystem as well. So I was out there looking at all the solar array technologies, looking at all the solar cell technologies, looking at what thermal materials were out there. And I really became fascinated by these new technologies. I had a chance to join Starburst Accelerator and help to introduce a lot of these small companies and startups to the traditional aerospace players, which is where I had come from. I ended up, so that was kind of business development. And then I ended up really liking the technology and the team at one of those startups, and we called Akash Systems, which is doing gallium nitride on diamond RF amplifiers. It's a thermal solution to an RF problem. So it was very fitting. I ended up joining there, but like any good startup, I was doing business development. I was doing a little bit of program and project management. And I really liked the program management aspect of it. And when the position became available at SpaceLink to join some of my former colleagues that came from Maxar and OneWeb, I jumped at that opportunity. I think, knowing kind of the satellite cradle to grave helps with program management. And then, just naturally, I'm a list maker, I'm a scheduler. I think I kind of have a natural fit towards that.
That's amazing. And that is, you outlined that so clearly. And I think sometimes when people look at transitions, there can be so much, I want to say detail in there, saying like, oh my God, this is how I felt, and then this is what I did. But I've never heard someone explain it so clearly with the transitions. And as you were explaining that, it really like clicked for me. I know it was across so many years, so to me it felt like it would have been more like complicated, but it was just so nicely put. So thank you. Okay, so I was curious about what made it feel like it was the right move. And so again, going back to that emotional experience and the felt relationship you have with your new role. Sometimes our job titles change or we make these transitions and we're technically in this like new box, but we still have to sort of navigate how we feel about it and what that means. And so in the past, I've heard certain technical leaders describe how there were certain things that they didn't expect about their new space, or even as people transition between two technical roles or two business roles, like different functions, maybe between sales and marketing, they are describing how it just feels like they've stepped into this whole new world. And so I'm curious about your felt experience with all of this.
Yeah, I kind of, I think with Akash, I kind of fell into, I was the first aerospace hire. We hired other folks from aerospace after me, but the team that I joined were material scientists and electrical engineers. So when I first started, my title was Director of Business Development. But we had a satellite project going on, and so I was kind of naturally the right person to manage that. And as I was sending out all these emails, and I think also having a feminine sounding name, I would reach out to a satellite manufacturer and say like, hey, I want to talk to you about a project that we're working on, blah, blah, blah. My signature line said Director of Business Development. And I would get emails back that said, oh, thank you for reaching out. I'd love to speak to your technical team tomorrow. And I was like, okay, well, here's the times that I'm available to talk to you. And I kind of quickly realized that I had a really hard time doing this job with that title. So I approached the management team and I said, hey, the title needs to allow you to do your job. That's the purpose of a title, to get you in the door where you need to be able to do your job. And if it's holding you back, then it's the wrong title. So I said, can we switch it to just Director of Space Systems? It was just like a name that I had made up, but it sounded pretty cool. And they were, perfectly accepting of that. And then, somebody's Director of Space Systems can do the BD role. But someone who's Director of BD has a hard time in an email signature line of doing that that program management kind of thing. And something similar happened at OneWeb. We had the team that was focused on, the RF side of things. And we just called them the comms team, the communications team, not even thinking that to outside people meant public relations or, or something that was not technical. So one of the women who's, MIT PhD educated just had on her business card communications. And as she was getting that out, people thought that she was the public relations person. So we go back, change the title, change the business cards, which I think is a little bit of a tangent to your question. But I think, in a startup, you can you get that freedom to step in, as long as you're not stepping on toes, you kind of have that freedom to step in where you're needed. I remember at one point the CEO saying, hey, can you do websites? Are you really good at that? And I was like, not my department. I will help with this. I will help with that. I will do lots of things that are not in my title, but I don't have a strength in anything graphic design related. You're not gonna want a website that I design. So I think there's kind of like what you naturally gravitate towards, and I was gravitating towards managing programs, keeping schedules, making sure that things were running on time, in addition to the business development work that I was doing. But I think a little bit of BD is, it is a little bit more 24/7, especially if you're supporting customers around the world, and that, I kind of wanted a little bit more of a work-life balance from the BD world. So program management can be 24/7 as well, but not necessarily as a part of the job description.
Absolutely. I would love to unpack a little bit more on some of the norms of business development and that work-life balance. I'm
Mm-hmm.
curious about what aspect of the job makes it 24/7. Is it the uh, interaction with the customers, as you said? Like, is that because of time difference, or like what exactly makes it so demanding?
Something that can make it demanding is that usually when you get a proposal or you get a request for quote, there's a very short turnaround time on that. And so there's, the day-to-day that you're doing, the emailing, the, marketing, the outreach that you're doing, that you still need to do. But then when you get that request for a quote or a request for a proposal, you need to focus your energy on that. And that can, in addition to keeping everything else going. So um, now I'm part of a company that kind of has more of a team doing that, but at, small startup, you're a team of one doing multiple different jobs.
Wow, yeah, really a
So
one-person show.
yeah, I mean, there
Yeah.
certainly was engineering support, and there was finance support and things like that from the operations side, but I was kind of primarily leading those efforts. And then yeah, international, and then the international aspect and across timelines, and then just you're kind of constantly always going through your pipeline list and making sure that you're aware of what's going on with that customer. Is this the right time to reach out to that customer? It's good practice to at least do weekly pipeline reviews in business development, and then you kind of are sending out a lot of emails as you're going through the pipeline, say, oh, I haven't connected with that person in a while, reach out, and then maybe they come back 20 minutes later, maybe they come back 20 days later, and so it's just this kind of constant cycle.
Wow, that's really good to know. Thank you so much for explaining that. And I think that's going to be super helpful for folks who are looking to do that pivot. And this is sort of bringing in that wellness piece to that new job title, because sometimes people fully may not know what they sign up for sometimes when they're looking for a career pivot. So just keeping this in mind and just knowing all of this is going to be so valuable. So thank you so much.
And I focused only on the negatives, but there's certainly positives.
Absolutely.
There's lots of people that are in that world and love it. And I just think for me, it was kind of time to find something that was a little bit more balanced.
Yes. Well, this is a podcast about balance and wellness.
Yes.
So thank you for your take on that. And I'd love to jump into the rapid fire round, but feel free to take a second longer if you really need to with any of these questions. So if you're ready, my first question for you is, what does wellness mean to you?
So balance, for sure. When I lived and worked in downtown, I had about a half an hour walk, put in a podcast in the morning. And when the pandemic hit, I kind of missed that time. And then I started doing podcasts just while I was like getting ready in the morning, getting my breakfast ready. And, I was living in a 1-bedroom at the, in March of 2020 when everything shut down. Just to get that like kind of that get me in the mood to start my day. I think it's physical, it's going outside, it's getting exercise, it's mental wellness. For me, right now I'm working on boundaries, I'm working on accepting things that I can't change, so kind of always working on that kind of wellness, the mental wellness too, so you can sleep at night.
Absolutely. Thank you. My next question for you is, what does effective leadership mean to you?
I love this question. I think leaders have a balance. Again, I'll use the word balance of high EQ, or sorry, having high EQ, and then part of that is they're balancing mentorship of you, maybe standing up for their employee when it's appropriate to do that, being that that person who's going to the right authority, and then also letting you spread your wings or pushing you outside of your comfort zone. And I've had really incredible bosses who have that balance. I've also had some bad bosses. I would categorize them as bad on two different spectrums. I've had what I would call an authoritarian style boss, who was somebody who would actually say, I'm the boss, what I say goes, and would stand up in front of colleagues and say, oh, what an idiot, in front of everybody else. That wasn't for me. Some people can take that. I couldn't work under those conditions. But then I had a boss who was kind of almost the opposite spectrum, mid-level manager who's looking to make it through the day. And when it came time for performance reviews, he said, you're one of my top rated employees because I only hear good things about you. I don't hear, you don't ever cause any problems, because he's dealing with, this person's not doing their work right. This person's not getting along with this person. So that was good to hear. But then it also creates an environment where you feel like you're being rewarded for being quiet, and not causing a problem. So if you have a problem, if you want that promotion, if you feel like you're being passed up by other people, it doesn't create an environment where you can feel comfortable coming to that boss. I had that leader in my 20s, and I probably wouldn't have, if I had them now, I probably wouldn't care, and I still would, I just rock the boat, but at the time, the message to me was, just keep your head down, keep quiet, don't cause any problems, don't ask for anything, and then you'll be highly rated. So I've seen a little bit of everything. I love that question.
Thank you. So my next question for you is, what is your morning and or night routine? And what do you usually do when you feel like you've fallen off track and need to bounce back?
I'll answer the second part, which is I think I just need to, rebalance what I'm doing, going back to just setting boundaries. I'm kind of an overexert myself kind of person. And so I'm learning not to do that. My morning routine usually centers around, so I've got a son who will be 2 in December of 2022, depending on when you're listening to this podcast. So a lot of it is, getting up in the morning, trying to get as ready as I can, get myself in the house as ready as I can before he wakes up, or he needs to be attended to in some way. Um, he goes to a daycare that's about a 15-minute walk. We live in the city of San Francisco, but in kind of a family friendly neighborhood, and I love that it's got playgrounds and parks everywhere. But I'm also like 1 block away from the main street that has the Walgreens and the Safeway and the dry cleaning. So I can like walk and drop him off, and then like drop my dry cleaning off, go to Walgreens, pick up a prescription, go to Safeway. I kind of love that mix a little bit, but it also, mostly it just forces me to do a half an hour walk in the morning, which I love. And then evenings, he forces me to get outside too. Going to pick him up. My husband and I kind of split those roles. I also go out of town more, and my husband's stuck with both pick up and drop off duty. And we try to hit the playground after daycare, see the same families all the time. And then it's kind of dinner, getting him ready. And then there's usually about an hour or two after he goes to bed of just catching up on bills, or catching up on work, or you know uh even just deciding it's a Netflix kind of night. And we're not gonna push ourselves. So really kind of just center around him right now in the mornings and evenings.
I love this. And it's so helpful to know about that breakdown again as younger gender minorities are joining the pipeline and they're thinking about being in a position like yourself. It's so helpful to know about that routine. So thank you so much for pulling the curtain back because it's knowing about those like little things that helps someone in their retention, like in all of those things that we talked about earlier. So
Mhm.
thank you once again. I was wondering if there's anything that you feel like you wanted to add to anything that we've spoken about so far, anything again that's still lingering.
Yeah, when I started my career, and I fall into the geriatric millennial generation. I feel like there were still a lot of women or minorities who were in the industry who kind of saw it as there's one seat at the table for us, and you're not going to take it. And I think a lot of them have retired. And that, by the way, was not every woman. There were so many women or allies, who saw me and were like, "You're going to promote this woman. We're gonna make sure she's trained up," and were completely supportive of me. But I did kind of see that there were people who kind of saw that there was one seat, and they had fought for it. They really had fought against hard odds. I think as I've gone on in my career, we're kind of at a level now where we want the whole table to be diverse or allies. And I love that. And I love that I'm seeing that so much more than the idea that there's only room for one. So just that, to kind of tie everything together that we talked about. And then I'm used to being the moderator at all of my events, so it's been really an honor to be on the other side of that. You are such a talented interviewer, you're such a talented podcaster, and you, Ricky, give so much to the community of yourself. And I'm honored to be able to support you in the work that you're doing in even a small way.
Oh my gosh, thank you so much. That means so much. As you were speaking, I was like letting that wash over me because it's
Good.
again so important, as you said, that we do, yeah, realize that there's more than one seat at the table and that we're advocating to pull up chairs to the table
Mhm.
or build our own tables. So this conversation and what you're doing and all of this is it's all of that. So again, thank you so much for your time. Thank you so much for joining me. And I'm so excited for people to hear all of your great advice.
Thank you.